for, not just for me, but for many in this room, has been instrumental and fundamental in understanding many, many concepts. I was thinking today that on a conference on networks and communities, who better to honor, because Peg is a pioneer historian of networks and communities, but she's also a polymath, and I think sometimes some people don't actually realize what Peg is up to, and it's not necessarily easy to figure out because you have to read a lot to understand her grand symphonic project, which started in the 80s with her really, I think, invention of a field of the study of the radical Enlightenment, which was such a great discovery that it has been, I don't know what the polite word is, taken by someone else and used. But if one reads carefully from the early 1980s onwards through the multiple editions of the work, so many of them, is it Unwin and Allen? I always sort of associate Peg with, is it Allen and Unwin or Unwin and Allen? Allen and Unwin. It wasn't just the radical Enlightenment, it was this giant view of Freemasons and pantheists and Newtonians and these networks and these different groups that were working together. And that is a life's work unto itself. But that is not only Peg Jacobs' vision. What she did from there in trying to define and help us understand the Enlightenment, which for me she did. I first read her in my first years of graduate school because I was having a hard time understanding what the Enlightenment was. I still don't necessarily completely understand. But what Peg did was connect these groups and these ideas into these bigger movements, such as the scientific revolution, but I think more interestingly, into a long history of also industrial revolution. Peg is known by some as an Enlightenment historian. Those who I think know her well will feel that she is a Dutch historian because she really insists on that, and if you work with her you end up having to work on Holland, and then you understand many more things, and you say, why don't we all study Dutch history? I can speak from experience. And again, so she's worked this sort of giant, what I sort of see it as this kind of growing, she's sort of been tracking or tracing the outlines of this sort of incredible intellectual and social spine which grew out of the 1670s across, in her case, Northwestern Europe and even across the Atlantic. But there are some other things about Peg which are sort of quite remarkable. She has, and one only finds this out by sort of spending time with Peg or going through her footnotes, she is a master archivist in many, many countries. And when I say master archivist, to hear Peg talk about her work on the 19th century Industrial Revolution and her archival work in North Central England is both inspiring and depressing, because you're like, what? You're also an expert in that? And you know those archives that well? And that, one could sort of see Peg as a polymath in that sense, but then the closer one looks, and I think also Peg's new work, Peg has been producing and working on this project for so long, and it's big and it's rich, and now I think she's really tying it all together. I think this is what she's trying to do, is really truly show how this sort of radical scientific thought grew into the Industrial Revolution, because Peg's also an economic historian. And so it's quite incredible, and it's quite ambitious. I also just wanted to say on a sort of personal note that Peg has had an extraordinary career. She, unlike many early modernists, did not go to an Ivy League school. She went to St. Joe's, and she worked her way up, which is not always the case in our field. And she has great vision, and I say this from personal experience, she also, and it's not any kind of cliche, is also a very courageous historian. And I think it takes courage, most of all, just to keep producing and writing. It's the hardest thing, and to keep thinking. I mean, that's the most brutal thing that I think we do. We don't necessarily always talk about it that way. But she is also a courageous person in life, and those who have worked with her and had their career with her know that. And she encourages people, quite literally. She can impart that courage, and that's a very unusual thing, and a very important thing, and an inspiring thing. So I'm just absolutely delighted to introduce this session, and our first speaker, who is such a good and old fop, friend of Peg. I was trying to think of the term of everybody on the panel today. They're all friends of Peg, but Joyce Appleby, her colleague at UCLA.
I had a real fright last night as I was rushing to go to hear the presidential address of Tony Grafton. I failed to close my hotel door properly. So when I returned and was walking down the corridor, I saw the door was ajar, and I thought with dismay, would anyone sneak in my room and steal my comments on the scholarship of Margaret Jacob? And I am very relieved to say that no one did. Isaiah Berlin describes scholars as divided between the hedgehog and the fox. In this famous essay, he said, "The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows only one big thing." I think that Margaret Jacob is both. I came to this conclusion after reviewing my bookshelf with all of her books on it. She has gone in several directions, but there is one big idea that has engaged her: how Newtonian mechanics offered provocative ideas and inspired practices that worked through science, politics, society, and industry to push the West towards modernity. In truth, Peg is more of a gopher than either a fox or a hedgehog. She burrows deep into her material, she searches out roots, and she creates tunnels to connect the new physics to religion, civil society, education, and industrialization. Her first book, The Newtonians and the English Revolution, launched a career in 1976 that has only grown more glorious in the last 35 years. The Gottschalk Prize members called it the best work of history on the 18th century. The frosting on this particular cake came a year later when Christopher Hill, the doyen of early modern history, wrote a long and appreciative review in the New York Review of Books. Not bad as a send-off for a newly minted PhD. What struck the prize committee members was the authoritative way that Peg showed how Newtonian physics provided the basis for a providential exegesis of Christian cosmology that tied religion, science, and politics into a mutually reinforcing intellectual structure that persisted until Charles Darwin's Origin of Species 2 centuries later. Exploring the writings, diaries, sermons, and relationships of England's Protestant leaders, Jacob showed how a group of latitudinarians found in the natural philosophy associated with Boyle and Newton the basis for linking God's providence to England's constitutional monarchy. A major conduit for this synthesis became the Boyle Lectures, which began in 1692. Without them, Jacob said, the Newtonian philosophy would not have existed by the early 18th century as a coherent system to be understood by anyone. Englishmen of gentle birth, with a predisposition for natural philosophy and the Protestant form of Christianity, had to chart a course between Scylla and Charybdis, navigating the choppy waters of England's century of revolution. The monster of Stuart pretensions challenged their freedom of inquiry, while the whirlpool of sectarian enthusiasm after Charles's execution threatened to suck them into political chaos. Whether there was motion in matter, or matter was seen as devoid of inherent properties, brutal and inert, might appear a purely scientific inquiry. But Jacob shows why the presentation of matter mattered. The view that matter had its own vitality opened an intellectual path to materialism and even atheism. But if it took a force like gravity to move matter, then there was a role for God. Newton's mathematically regulated universe provided a model for divinely ordered stability of church and state. For Jacob, archival research is akin to godliness. It opens the door to a kind of academic salvation. Her own archival trail is worth following. While studying the Newtonians, she delved into the papers of the free thinker John Toland. There she found minutes of a meeting of some sort of an organization in the Netherlands, along with a list of its members. With this intriguing bait, Jacob crossed the English Channel to Leiden to check out Toland's organization, and she discovered a trove of material on a Masonic lodge. Toland had gone back and forth between his home in England and the more tolerant intellectual milieu of the Low Countries, and so did Peg, spending 18 months with the Marchand Papers while detailing the activities of the Knights of Jubilation, which met in The Hague. Along with the Tolan, its membership included Bernard Picard, the illustrator of the world's religious ceremonies and customs of 1720 and 30, and the subject of her last two books. But I digress. The tunnel to the Marchand Papers led Peg to another groundbreaking book, The Radical Enlightenment. Its title alone provoked scholars to consider the range of opinions present in the Enlightenment. Her subtitle, Pantheists, Freemasons, and Republicans, speaks to the radicals whose rationalism led them to attack revealed religion and question monarchical authority. When Peg was an undergraduate at the Catholic St. Joseph's College in Brooklyn, she edited a Sub Rosa periodical which she titled Luther. She is naturally drawn to subversive figures, but true to her hedgehog ways, she didn't stray from Newtonian ideas, for she was able to demonstrate the importance of Freemasonry as a vehicle for their transmission. She also argued that lodges, more than scientific societies or literary circles or salons, were the embraced an egalitarian ideology and social code that stressed the bonds of brotherhood and provided a link between the functioning of civil society and the intellectual imperatives of the Enlightenment. For Jacob, the Masonic movement was a part of a secular trend that shifted attention from religion to politics. As the state became more powerful in the early 18th century, an impulse to participate in the Republican rituals and rules of Masonic lodges drew some men, noblemen, gentry, professionals together. From the sociability of the lodges, Peg later saw a form of cosmopolitanism taking shape, where some people were strangers nowhere in the world, the title of a later work. By 1981, when the Radical Enlightenment appeared, the English short title catalogue, with its bibliographical record of British publication from 1473 to 1800, became searchable. Using Newton as her Ariadne's thread, Peg made the startling discovery that the majority of citations to him dealt with applied mechanics. This English record contrasted with that of the Netherlands, where there were no publications on the application of Newtonian principles. An extraordinarily fruitful avenue of research now opened up to follow the conduits of communication about Newtonian mechanics to the inventors who carried them into English mines and factories. More exhaustive searches of archives led in swift succession to publications of Newton and the Culture of Newtonians, The Cultural Meaning of the Scientific Revolution, Scientific Culture in the Making of the Industrial West, and Practical Matter, Newton's Science in the Service of Industry and Empire. Over time, France, Germany, and Belgium were added to the Netherlands and Great Britain as sites for her careful inspection. Rolled out in this way makes it appear that Peg had trod a smooth, unencumbered trail, but that is far from the truth. From her first monograph to her present work, she has had to hack her way through a thicket of controversy. Three are significant: the battle over her association of scientific achievement with politics, the conflict over what was radical in the Radical Enlightenment, and finally the relevance of culture to the making of the Industrial West. In the Newtonians and the English Revolution, Jacob was a pioneer among the new historians of science who deemed the social context essential to understanding the reception, interpretation, and even generation of the work of natural philosophers. Historians of science have often presumed that new mechanical philosophy triumphed in England, she wrote, simply because it offered the most plausible explanation of nature. It just may do that, she added, covering her bases, but in my understanding of the historical process, that is not the primary reason for its early success. Attributing ideological content to scientific achievement is hardly novel today, but 40 years ago, the principal scholars of Newtonian physics, conceived of their roles as something like the Vestal Virgins, keeping the fire of genius from any dousing by sociologists or psychoanalysts or whipsnappers in the history profession. I think we need to remind ourselves of the dominance of that proleptic, progressive view of history that continued until the 1960s, in which people in the past were seen as eagerly embracing innovations so that they could move into the modern era. The Newtonians and the English Revolution was like a gauntlet thrown down before men like Newton's formidable biographer, Richard Westphal, a thinker of a positivist cast who asserted that Newton's genius, uninhibited by prejudice and superstition, was sufficient to establish the law of universal gravity. Here Pegg endorsed the tactic that the best defense is an offense. I well remember a session of the AHA like this one some 30 years ago when she rose from the audience to question the assertions of the august Westphal. The second big controversy in Pegg's career came after an academic demonstration that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Jonathan Israel liked the title Radical Enlightenment so much he used it for a book of his own in 2001. But his was no copy, but rather a challenge to Pegg's thesis. Both Israel and Jacob agreed that there were two rival wings of the Enlightenment, a moderate one trying to synthesize the old and the new, and a radical one wishing to sweep aside old structures entirely. They saw, too, that the radical Enlightenment rose above national boundaries and that there was a republic of letters that was international in scope. Where they differed was on the content of the radical Enlightenment. Israel insisted on the unique and overpowering influence of Baruch Spinoza, whom he credited alone with producing a modernity compounded of rationalization and secularization through a critique of the inherited shared core of faith, tradition, and authority. It might be added that Spinoza believed that motion was inherent in matter. Pegg had brought Spinoza's materialism and pantheism to scholarly discussions, but she also stressed other factors like the sensibilities, sociability of the Masonic lodges that gave expression to radical political alternatives. 2.5 times the size of Jacob's radical Enlightenment, Israel's cast a net wide enough to bring in all those who might possibly have been influenced by Spinoza, even figures totally unimportant, even figures previously seen as English originals. Israel dismissed as unimportant the Hague group whom Pegg studied. Similarly relegated to the periphery were England's political innovations, nor did a Newton, who has God's universal laws, interest Israel. More to their contrasting approaches, Israel gave minimal attention to the context in which his radical Spinozan texts were generated, arguing that there were crypto-Spinozians and even thinkers unaware that Spinoza had influenced their thought. Israel drew an ample target for Jacob's arrows as they went mano a mano on 2 continents for half a decade. In 2005, Pegg published a revised second edition of her Radical Enlightenment to put in print her summation of their rival conclusions. This move typified Jacob's hedgehog side. She stays with an argument, sometimes augmenting a first work with further publications presenting new material, as she is now doing with her pivotal work on the Industrial Revolution. Newton's elucidation of motion had much to contribute to those who wanted to harness natural forces to lift and rotate, stretch, and carry objects. Surprisingly, before the publication of The Cultural Meaning of the Scientific Revolution, scholars had done little to connect the steam engine with the scientific principles that enabled it to work. There was either the unexamined assumption that the knowledge was somehow in the air, or credit was given to the much-admired tinkerers who invented from experience. Designing the intricate arrangement of boilers, pistons, condensers, and drive shafts required knowledge. It took an historian of both science and society to see that there was a problem here. In refusing to take for granted the dissemination of Newtonian mechanics, Peg raised a new set of questions that could only be answered by the kind of local archival research she is famous for. She worked both ends of the puzzle, examining the transit of knowledge from traveling lectures, coffee houses, courses, textbook publications, and scientific societies as an interlocking part of a communication network. But she also studied the papers of inventors like James Watts and Matthew Boulton and Josiah Wedgwood to learn how they personally acquired specific knowledge of Newtonian principles. But even here, controversy raised its lively head because some economists refused to see the relevance of cultural factors to industrialization. The economic historian Robert Allen has written that the Industrial Revolution was a response to the opportunity to make money prompted by England's high-wage, cheap energy economy that in turn was the result of England's prosperity of the previous century. While acknowledging my fellow panelist Joel Mokyr's work on social context, Allen makes the profit of profits central. Bringing back the tinkers without the designation, Allen argues the superior importance of micro-inventions over macro-inventions. To this generalization, he noted only one exception: the steam engine. Needless to say, such a concession was catnip to the historian we are honoring in this session. Research and writing have not exhausted Peg's great reserves of energy. There have been associations founded and headed, and conferences organized and participated in. Well, she was at the Getty a few years ago with both Wijnand Mijnhardt, who can't be with us this afternoon, and Lynn Hunt. They worked on Bernard Picard's Religious Ceremonies of the World. Significant because it was the first effort to gather this kind of religious information, the 7-volume work became the focus of a conference and 2 publications. Peg was also interested in getting digitized images and texts of the volume on the web, not just in English, but in French, Dutch, and German. All this took endless meetings with a variety of different institutions. Watching her orchestrate these efforts, a Getty staffer mused, "I wonder if we could get Peg Jacob interested in world peace." I believe that the greatest influence on Peg have been Newton and the people who mastered Newtonian physics in order to teach it to others. They infused her with a respect for truth, or perhaps more modestly, accurate knowledge, and also with the hard work it takes to secure it. They also drew her admiration for lives lived attuned to their society and its needs. Peg has argued first and foremost for the power of ideas, and secondarily for the impossibility of understanding them without a deep immersion in the culture which produced them. If she has spread her archival net widely to take in subversive thinkers and provocative sociability and instrument makers and itinerant lecturers and inventors' libraries and school curricula, it's because her instincts align her with William James, who said of causality, "Every difference makes a difference." Like the hedgehog, she has known one big thing, that Newton played a crucial role in shaping modern history. Like the fox, she has learned a half-dozen ways to demonstrate this. And like the gopher, she has always gone for the roots.
That was beautiful. Our next speaker is David Bell, Princeton University.
Thank you very much. It's really a great honor to be here today and to take part in this session in honor of somebody whose work I've been reading with such pleasure for so long. In recent years, as everybody knows, there's been an explosion of sorts of enlightenments, plural, in historical discourse. Once upon a time, Ernst Cassirer could identify the Enlightenment with a grand, illustrious philosophical dialectic. Peter Gay could associate it with a little flock of philosophes. No longer. Today we hear tell of multiple enlightenments, conservative enlightenments, religious enlightenments, Caribbean enlightenments, even English enlightenments, not to mention radical and moderate enlightenments, which I'll be coming back to. And because of this profusion, I'm very hesitant to propose another, but I can't resist. So what I would like to talk about here today is, I think, something that deserves to be called the Jacobean Enlightenment. Now, the term could lead to some confusion, obviously. Maybe questions about whether good King James was a secret freethinker. Perhaps he was reading Spinoza, as Jonathan Israel might suggest. But I suppose in at least some ways the confusion could be fortuitous. And after all, Peg Jacob has always insisted in her work on the connection between the Enlightenment and a scientific revolution that in its origins goes back to the reign of James. And she's also, of course, insisted on tying the Enlightenment to the political turmoil of 17th century Britain, turmoil which may have had its roots also in the reign of James. But in proposing the term Jacobean Enlightenment, I'm obviously suggesting something rather different. I mean really three things by it. First, an Enlightenment whose crucial period in many ways is not the mid-18th century of the High Enlightenment, but the decades around 1700. Second, an Enlightenment which is really not located in any particular place, like Paris, but rather in networks of travel and communication that met and joined above all in that grand central station of thought that was the early modern Netherlands. And third, an Enlightenment that's defined both by the radical content of its works, but also equally by a rich set of social, cultural, and political practices. So in a sense, an Enlightenment which is inseparable from its social, cultural, and political contexts. Now, as everybody here also knows, contextualization has in some ways been very much the name of the game in Enlightenment studies over the past generation. It has taken very different forms. You could speak of what I think of at least as the sort of Chartier style of contextualization, which pays meticulous attention to the conditions of production and reception of texts, sometimes even at the risk of losing sight of their content. There is, of course, the Cambridge style, depending on the meticulous reconstruction of political languages and sets of intellectual interlocutors. I suppose we could also speak in some ways of the Jonathan Israel style, in which the context consists of the distance separating any particular intellectual object from Spinoza. I'm sorry if I keep referring to Jonathan Israel. I just finished a long essay about his most recent book, and since it is 1,000 pages long, it is hard to get it out of my mind. But let me return to the more happy subject of the Jacobean style of contextualization and the Jacobean Enlightenment that it defines. What I've always found so wonderful about Peg Jacob's work is precisely that it explores in so many different contexts the phenomenon of the Enlightenment. And in some ways, I wondered, going back over her works in preparation for this talk, whether at some point she had sat down and planned, well, I'm going to look at it in this context and in this one, and sort of planned out an entire career moving from one context to the other. Probably not. But it does, in fact, have that kind of systematic. What's wonderful about it is it did coalesce into that systematic form in many ways, and yet in each of the works there's always a sense of the multiple contexts at work. So what I would actually like to try to do here in the time that I have left is to survey these contexts. I'm going to pick out 6 of them in particular, and then to conclude very briefly with some speculation as to what they all add up to. So the first context, I think, is political, and I think it's very important to keep this in mind, defined above all by the political extremes of the 17th century. On the one hand, we have the British Civil Wars of the 1640s and the extraordinary radical and millenarian movements that they nourished. Unless we're prepared to believe that philosophical radicalism did burst forth Athena-like from the head of certain 17th century thinkers, it does seem, I think, absurd to deny the connections between this amazing political moment in the 1640s and the intellectual developments that began to take place across the Channel at roughly the same time. And in any case, in Peg Jacob's book, The Radical Enlightenment, we already have a compelling account of these connections. And then, on the other hand, we have the political repression of the powerful repression, of political and religious dissent on the European continent in the latter part of the century, culminating in the persecution and the expulsion of the Huguenots from France in 1685. And this is a crucial moment in Peg Jacob's work. These latter events had, of course, at least 3 important consequences. They represented a shocking new model of intolerance against which doctrines of toleration could be forged. They created the Huguenot diaspora, which served as the principal transmission vector of radical ideas in the period, particularly through the circulation of clandestine manuscripts. And they led to the development of the critically important French-speaking colony of sorts, Huguenot colony in the Netherlands. So then the first context is the political one. Talking about the Netherlands brings me to the second context, which is sociocultural and comes under the heading of cosmopolitanism. Now this has been most directly the subject of Peg Jacobs' book, Strangers Nowhere in the World, but it has been a constant theme through all her works. Situations where people from different nationalities, languages, classes, religions mixed together, confronted each other, exchanged both things and ideas, and then grew accustomed to their mutual differences, I think have clearly been something that's fascinated her all through her career. It's obviously a commonplace going back to Voltaire that cosmopolitanism promoted tolerance. But she's gone beyond this, showing the way that cosmopolitanism promoted skepticism and even natural religion by leading people to think about different beliefs and different creeds as objects that were suitable for comparison, suitable even for scientific study, leading up to Picard and Bernard's Encyclopedic Religious Ceremonies of the World, which was, as the authors of this book have shown, an exemplary product and vehicle of early modern cosmopolitanism in precisely this sense. And while Strangers Nowhere in the World opens actually in Avignon, clearly the single most important venue for cosmopolitan exchange was the Netherlands. And we can just parenthetically, one of the most remarkable things that I learned going back to her work in some of her recent articles is that of the 1.5 million individuals who flocked to the Dutch seaboard cities in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, only a third actually came from the Dutch countryside, the migration pattern one might expect, with the rest coming mostly from abroad, Huguenots, Jews, British, Germans, Italians, what have you, creating a truly unprecedented human brassage. Now, of course, most of these people came to the Netherlands to trade rather more tangible things than ideas, but commerce, too, matters for the Enlightenment, and it forms the third important context that I'd like to briefly outline for Peg's work. Now, in recent years, of course, many scholars, some of them here in this room today, have turned away from the idea of a bourgeois capitalist Enlightenment to suggest, in fact, that much about Enlightenment thought may have been fundamentally anti-capitalist. But Jacob makes a very compelling case that Enlightenment thought was deeply bound to a conception of proper, honest commerce. As she puts it in a recent article, the market, capital, and a money economy had become so naturalized in the world of the Enlightenment as to be entirely inescapable. Particularly important to her, and one of the great examples of commerce, is then the book trade and the role of Huguenot publishers like Jean-Frédéric Bernard and his son-in-law, Marc Michel Rey. After reading Jacob, it is hard to imagine the Enlightenment without these commercial figures. Now, it could also be argued that the commercial economy provided, for Enlightenment thinkers, a model of human interaction in which religious and national differences counted for little, in a sense that it offered the image of a kind of cosmopolitan counter-society in which the violent hatreds and repressions that had scarred so many representatives of the early radical Enlightenment were finally and happily absent. But while this counter-society existed really as an image in the minds of its beholders, there was another counter-society that had much more tangible form. And I'm speaking here of the world of the Freemasons, and of course its masonry and its associated forms of sociability that make up the fourth context that I'd like to invoke. And of course, Peg Jacob has been an absolutely pioneering historian of this subject. Freemasonry provides as close a direct connection as there was between the English millenarians of the mid-17th century and the radical Aufklärer and revolutionaries of the 18th. And as she argues, the lodges also provided a way to experiment with new forms of human association. And they were, despite the legends, neither utopian nor regimented, but pragmatic, secular, and potentially egalitarian. And if their esoteric rituals sometimes seemed to overwhelm these other qualities, the rituals themselves could be traced back to the Hermetic, cosmopolitan traditions of the Renaissance, which also lay behind the radical Enlightenment. Now, mentioning this Hermetic tradition brings me to the fifth context, one of the more purely intellectual ones. And here what strikes me as one particular strength of Jacobean analysis is its meticulous attention to an entire broad intellectual field. One thing that makes The Radical Enlightenment as a book so powerful is that it demonstrates just how many intellectual currents flowed together in the 17th century, with the Hermetic learning of the Renaissance alongside the various currents of the scientific revolution and also Puritan millenarianism all coming together at the same time. And the book highlights, as has already been mentioned, the tensions between the different stands and the dialectical relationship between what she terms the radical and moderate enlightenments. I think it's actually worth noting here that some of the most significant histories of the Enlightenment have tended to feature some sort of dialectical tension of this sort. For Cassirer, there was the dialectical tension between the schools of Descartes and Leibniz. For Peter Gay, there was the one between Christianity and pagan antiquity. For Margaret Jacob, there are the moderate and radical enlightenments. I think it's significant that Jonathan Israel's story of the Enlightenment, there he is again, seems at first glance to involve something similar, but in fact it lacks dialectical tension entirely. His own versions of the radical and moderate enlightenments never really interact. There's nothing like what Peg Jacob calls John Toland's heretical reading of Newton in the service of a dynamic materialism. They're simply the true enlightenment for him and then the weak, fake imitation. And I think her version of this interaction and the relation between radical and moderate enlightenments is not only much meatier and intriguing, I think it's ultimately much more convincing. Speaking of this heretical reading of Newton and heresy, I come to the sixth and final context that I'd like to mention, namely the religious context. Now, for a long time, those who studied the early Enlightenment tended to see it through the lens of Paul Hazard, therefore to see it in terms of a straightforward struggle between secularists and their traditional religious foes. And with Jonathan Israel, there has been a move back towards this vision. But this way of looking at things, I think, misses the profound drama of change within European Christianity in the 17th century and on both sides of the Reformation divide. It misses what Marcel Gauchet has nicely called the exit from religion, the way the divinity was imagined as ever more mysterious, ever more unknowable, ever more remote from a natural universe that now had to be understood on its own terms, according to its own natural, knowable laws. On the Catholic side, the vehicle for the most daring speculations was Jansenism. The Protestants, meanwhile, followed the long and winding road that led through Arminianism, through Socinianism, towards Unitarianism, and finally to natural religion, pure and simple, as Peg Jacob puts it. And I think her work has always been attuned to this drama as well, and never more than in the most recent books on Picard and Bernard. So, as I started by saying, since the 1960s, there has been, of course, this massive sea change in Enlightenment studies. In place of a narrow focus on a little flock of philosophes, we have seen this thing, the Enlightenment, recast as a broad cultural movement that involved Freemasons, publishers, journalists, peddlers, liberal theologians, contributors to essay contests, and much, much more, not just in Paris, but across the Western world and beyond. If Edmund Burke once excoriated what he called the conquering empire of light and reason, well, now we are putting the spotlight on its foot soldiers, and they have moved to the front of the scene. In the process, the Enlightenment has certainly become a more difficult phenomenon to study. Sometimes it seems to have grown so expansive and so fragmented as practically to dissolve before our eyes, but not when seen through the Jacobean lens, which insists on such careful attention not just to these multiple players and their multiple contexts, but crucially to the way that they all interact, to the way that they frame a great dramatic story, and the story itself, a story of the intellectual currents that bound it all together. And so for illuminating so much of this remarkable canvas and for helping so vitally to open it up in the first place, in short, for giving us the Jacobean Enlightenment, we are grateful. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Darrin McMahon, Florida State University.
Thank you, Jake. Try to move this here. Well, it's a genuine pleasure and honor to be able to sit on a panel like this one, although I have to say I do so somewhat sheepishly, given that I don't know Peg as well as nearly all the other panelists. And in fact, although we've done a number of events together as colleagues over the last several years, I know her originally as a rather wide-eyed student from afar. I doubt whether Peg will even remember this, but I first spoke to her as a graduate student in Paris when I was there doing the very first months of my dissertation research. And she called me up from the United States. I don't know how she got my number. I hadn't given it to her, although I was living in John Merriman's apartment, and I suppose you just ring up the operator and say, patch me through to Merriman, Paris, and you get there eventually. In any case, the phone rang very early in the morning, and this was in the days before email, and I just sent her a letter, and she was there on the other end and said, I have some notes for you, and I quickly came to, and she gave me all kinds of sort of helpful and detailed advice and encouragement. And I remember hanging up the phone afterwards and thinking to myself, how much that kind of gesture can mean to a young scholar, and it certainly meant to me. And everything that I've ever heard about Peg from graduate students and young scholars since that time has sort of reaffirmed that initial impression that this was not only a great scholar, but a great teacher and a great mentor. And sadly, those things don't always go together, so I just wanted to register that. When Jake and Tony very kindly asked me to participate today, they requested a title, and I gave them as the title, The Many Enlightenments of Margaret Jacob. And I fear that David and I probably should have compared notes before today, because you'll hear some of the same themes. Dan Edelstein, in our presence now, has noted recently in his provocative little book, The Enlightenment, a Genealogy, that there's a tendency today to give everyone and anyone their own private enlightenment. Enlightenments now come in many flavors, shapes, and sizes. There are, as David had already suggested, high and low enlightenments, and radical and modern enlightenments, Protestant and Jewish enlightenments, counter enlightenments, enlightenments too hard, too soft, and some just right. We have, if Ulrich Lehner can be trusted, enlightened Benedictines and a Benedictine enlightenment. Gertrude Himmelfarb, and she's by no means alone, writes of a Methodist enlightenment, with John Wesley, a man whom E.P. Thompson once accused, perhaps just a tad strongly, of practicing psychic masturbation and religious terrorism. Wesley is now the model of the enlightened man. All of which leads me to wonder whether Immanuel Kant got it wrong. To judge by much of the current historiography, to ask was ist Aufklärung, is to conclude that the 18th century was not only an age of enlightenment, but it was an enlightened age. With this explosion of private enlightenments, the general willingness to confer enlightenment on any and all tells us as much, I suspect, about our own times as it does about the 18th century, with each separate group and constituency contained either in narrow monographical isolation or in distinct strands of discourse, or, in the case of studies like that of Jonathan Israel, present in the same volume, but sealed off nonetheless by impermeable conceptual borders to prevent the moderate from sharing any common ground with the radical or the unenlightened at all. The enlightened world of Margaret Jacob, by contrast, is a more fluid and potentially more harmonious place. To be sure, she's under no illusions regarding the forces that sought to separate men and women in the 18th century, and frequently did, the forces that prevented them from living in common and cosmopolitan consort. And there's a candid and altogether level-headed realism to so much of Peg's work. If the Age of Enlightenment was a great cosmopolitan age, as she so wonderfully shows, its, quote, open, tolerant, and benign posture did not come about then or now, she writes, automatically or even easily. The new civic culture that the Enlightenment helped to form was rather made, painstakingly and slowly, and by many hands. The mental landscape of the public sphere, to cite the title of an article of Peg's from the early 1990s, was European-wide, and it coalesced in many spaces. And it's significant, I think, that well before the current flurry of interest in space as a conceptual category, Peg was thinking very deeply about it. In the halls of Masonic lodges, most prominently, but in other places across Europe besides, whether these be the printer shops and the cities where they clustered, like Amsterdam and The Hague, or in the virtual republic of enlightened natural philosophers, alchemists, doctors, and the engineers and mechanics, who, as Peg has repeatedly insisted, fully shared what she's called the Enlightenment's interest in the practical and applied, living that interest every day. Or to take another space, the public exchanges and bourses, from Bruges to Antwerp to London and Lyon, where men and a good many women gathered and put enlightened ideals like tolerance and civility, politeness and cosmopolitanism and the rule of law into effect. What characterized these spaces then, in part, was their permeability and transformative capacity. Something was true even of Masonic lodges, which were, of course, in many ways sealed off and closed from the outside world. As Pegg puts it in the conclusion to Living the Enlightenment, for all its exclusivity, secrecy, and gender bias, Freemasonry transmitted and textured the Enlightenment, translated all the cultural vocabularies of its members into a shared and common experience that was civil and hence political. What were these cultural vocabularies? One way of thinking of them, in keeping with the common parlance of today, would be as private enlightenments, or as varieties of enlightenment. And of these varieties, there are a great many in Pegg's work, as there are a great many in the lodges and other places where enlightenment was lived. There are, for example, national enlightenments, an English enlightenment, certainly an outgrowth of Newtonian science and the radicalization or republicanism of the English civil wars, translated to the continent and especially to the Dutch. At the same time that the late and much missed Roy Porter was reminding us of what really should never have been in doubt, in other words, that there was an English enlightenment, Pegg was making it very clear that Franco Venturi's old canard that England couldn't have had an enlightenment because it didn't have philosophes was misconceived. The Radical Enlightenment was published in the same year, 1981, as Porter's important edited volume, The Enlightenment in National Context, in which he first began to make the case for an English Enlightenment, along with Professor Pocock and others, that culminated in the publication of his Enlightenment, Britain and the Creation of the Modern World, published in the year 2000. By which point, Pegg could legitimately say, an English Enlightenment? I've been there and I've done that. In the same year as the publication of the Radical Enlightenment, and in Porter's very volume, Simon Schama argued that there was not a whole lot more to be studied in the Dutch Enlightenment. Simon has been right about a lot of things over the years, but this is not one of them. And of course, Pegg, along with her close colleague, Wijnand Mijnhardt, really put the Dutch Enlightenment on the map of the international scholarly community as a central enlightened space, a space that, like her other spaces of enlightenment, mediated and transformed, reconciled and translated competing currents and cultural vocabularies, including English republicanism and bastard Newtonian science, the voices of French Protestant exiles, Spinoza, the Knights of the Jubilation, and many others. A Dutch Enlightenment? Been there, done that. And of course it was from this same heady brew, a pinch of Hobbes, a little Toland, a bit of Spinoza, some radical Whigs, a few Masons, and by the miracle of Newtonian alchemy, you get Radical Enlightenment, about which enough has already been said. Radical Enlightenment, been there, done that. We could quite easily continue in this way because Pegg has been out in front of so many scholarly developments and 18th century studies over the course of her remarkable career. There's an international Protestant enlightenment in her work. There's a high enlightenment, a low enlightenment. There is a counter-enlightenment, ever present on the margins, and which in fact first gave me inspiration to pursue my own work on the subject. But the point is, or at least the point I'd like to make now, is that although there are many enlightenments in the work of Margaret Jacob, there's also an enlightenment that draws all these together. Enlightenment is the space, the civic space, in which its many permutations are mediated and come together. And so what you don't get in Margaret Jacob's work is a scholarly map cut up and divided by walls and barriers and boundaries and frontiers, a scholarly map in which moderate and radical never overlap or touch, in which an English Enlightenment is cordoned off from the French, in which the high Enlightenment is too lofty for the low, in which atheists and deists and theists share no common space. Life, thankfully, is not always so ordered, neat, and distinct, and Margaret Jacob's Enlightenment is nothing if not lived in flesh and blood. Which is not to say that ideas don't matter in her work. I once, or rather recently, heard her say that if ideas don't matter, we'd all be out of a job. But it's ideas as they animate human beings in social spaces that matter most to Margaret Jacob, and her enlightenment were offered a synthetic vision of their many intersections, a synthetic vision of the whole, a vision of a space in which radical and moderate can blur and overlap, and frequently do, in which lofty Newtonian physics get covered in machinery grease, in which Catholics like Bernard Picard can become Protestants, in which men and women of very different outlooks and predispositions might meet and do business or just talk for a while. It's a space that has been constructed, or rather reconstructed, slowly, painfully, painstakingly, and in incredible detail over the course of 3 decades, and in its all-encompassing dimensions, its reach and pan-European scope, it resembles nothing less than the enlightenments of that movement's greatest chroniclers, those of Franco Venturi, Peter Gay, Ernst Cassirer. I have a vision of Margaret Jacob sitting somewhere in a Masonic temple or Shriner's Lodge in the Midwest, quite sure this has happened, nursing a vodka tonic and explaining to a group of wizened individuals with secret handshakes and funny hats a little of their own institutional history, while learning a little bit about lives very different from our own. It's a slightly amusing juxtaposition, but in some ways it's a perfect vision of the Enlightenment as both ideal and lived reality. I'm sure that the Masons were grateful. I know that I am. Thank you, Peg, for enlightening us all.
Wijnand Mijnhardt can't be here today, and so our next speaker is Joel Mokyr.
Thank you.
From Northwestern.
So, I find myself often being the token economist, an audience historian, the token historian, the token of economist. So that's why I have PowerPoint. I am the token economist here, and my talk will be very different from the others. I will not survey Peg's work because the others have a comparative advantage in that, and I'm just going to try to explain what her work has meant to the sort of little niche that I and my colleagues as economic historians occupy. And so I want to talk about something quite different, which is cultural entrepreneurs, and try to see if I can persuade. So here is what I think of now as the great dilemma of modern economic growth. As many of you surely are aware, the economic history profession of the last 25 years, and not just the economic history profession, basically economics at large, has come increasingly to realize the big difference between societies that are in some ways economically successful and grow and industrialize and so on and so forth, and societies that do not, is what Douglas North has called institutions, and there's a whole school of people who actually working in this case, and this is Douglas North, Bill Bommel, Avner Greif, Mokyr Robinson, and so on and so forth. So this is, now institutions are extremely useful and important in economic history. They explain efficient allocation, they explain investment and commercial relations, their investments, law and order, less rent seeking, less corruption, more market, more efficient public goods, a whole bunch of things. They're really quite critical to successful society. The problem, of course, is that if you are trying to explain the Industrial Revolution and Europe's economic progress in the 19th century, this doesn't get you very far, because much of Asia has sophisticated, commercialized and monetized economies around 1600 or 1700. China, for example, seems to have even better institutions than Europe. It has lower taxes, it has a meritocratically appointed civil service, a high level, very high level of internal commerce, good property rights, and peace. I mean, how can you beat that? So the question is about technology. And of course, that is where Europe does differ. You know, it's hard to argue that by 1700 Europe has obviously superior institutions, but there are, I think, certainly by 1700, conditions in place in which rendered Europe capable of a more powerful technological momentum. Okay, and so, while of course technological progress does not, and this literature is huge, and Peg and many others have contributed, there's no clear-cut, simple, linear way in which technological progress depends on scientific progress, but it clearly does depend on a sort of more broader concept of intellectual innovation, which I'm not going to define here. So what I propose to do, and I think that this is you will see very soon why this is very appropriate to a session on Jacob, is to sort of try to build a bridge between the two, trying to build a bridge between how culture affects technological progress at this stage. And so I would, from the point of view of economic history, I would think that the Jacob thesis would be something along the lines of that between 1500 and 1700, of course, beyond it, Europe develops a culture that's conducive to and suitable for intellectual innovations and the accumulation of the kind of useful knowledge that it needs for industrialization, and it provides the support for institutions that are friendly to technological progress. And so to make this argument, I want to develop a little bit, and this is going to be just very, very crude and rough terms, but you'll see where I'm going with it, a model of what I call choice-based cultural innovation. So here's a few preliminary remarks, and I'll show you what the setup is, and then you'll see exactly where Jacob fits in all this, okay? One important remark, of course, is whose choices matter. So the truth is, and this is something that probably a lot of people will get angry at me for saying it, but I think this is hard to argue, is that to understand the sources of economic growth, culture matters, but we rarely have to know the culture of most people. In all due respect to popular culture, it's largely irrelevant here. What matters, of course, is the cultural beliefs of a fairly thin elite that determines the long-run technological trends of the economy, okay? So in the Middle Ages, these are literate monks, and today they are numerate nerds, okay? And what about the period in between? Well, this is in some sense what Robert Hooke, right at the time that we're all also interested in, makes this point, okay? And he has a wonderful quote, which I love and I've used before, and he basically talks about this sort of very small number, which he calls this newfound world must be conquered, that paragraph in red, by a Cartesian army, okay, well-disciplined and regulated, so their numbers be but small. And I think this is obviously somebody writing in 1666, but there is, I think, some truth to this. So, who are these people? Well, I made sort of a short list of it. They're scientists, engineers, and inventors, of course, themselves. And there are what I call implementers and tweakers. These are the sort of fiddlers and tinkerers that people talked about. But there are other people who are not necessarily in the technology themselves. The entrepreneurs, the financiers, politicians, community organizers. That's not an anachronism. I don't know what is. Aristocrats and royalty, whom others would want to imitate, and cultural leaders, intellectuals, teachers, priests, and writers, and so it's a very small layer of society. Isn't even all of literate and educated society, but these are the people whose culture really matters. Okay, so let me basically just point out, and this is clearly going beyond the scope of this talk, is that there actually are frameworks to analyze the sort of cultural evolution over time. And this is much indebted to work of a group of people. These are economists nor historians, but actually do work in a field called cultural evolution. Classic work of Boyd and Richardson, Jablonka and Lamb, Missouri, and similar scholars. These are not, so for the tedious details, you can see this book, the 2012 date there is extremely optimistic, but never mind that. But what counts here is actually quite simple, okay? Culture, unlike, say, the rules and norms which provide the incentive structure under which economic behavior takes place, is to some degree a choice variable. And it's a choice variable in the following sense. People grow up, this is a simplification obviously, but they grow up with what you might think of as sort of the default option, namely the beliefs, the preference that they are socialized with by their parents or their people who educate them. But there is a market for ideas out there, and individuals can, at some stage of their life, choose a set of different ideas and preferences and deviate from their parents. So, one example that Boyd and Richardson are talking about, just to give you some kind of idea, is what they call content bias. Okay? So this means basically that if new evidence or new mathematical technique or something that comes to light, it may force people to change their mind about some cultural element or belief, which can then, in some cases, lead to changes in economic behavior. A good example would be something like the discovery of the germ theory, after 1865. So people do change their beliefs as a result of that, because there's sort of obvious evidence that what causes disease, and it's microbes, not miasmas, and that changes the demand for certain goods, such as clean water, that kind of example. So how do people choose in this kind of market? Well, they make very infrequent choices, of course. In most cases, probably they stick with the default. I haven't measured that, but that sort of seems reasonable. Economic considerations are, of course, relevant when people change their beliefs. And they tend to choose the kind of values and social beliefs that are consonant with their economic interests. I don't think you have to be a historical materialist to believe that, but if you believe that's the only thing going on, then you are in some kind of orthodox historical materialist world, which neither Peg and I would find themselves Now, of course, unlike the market for commodity, where people make rational choices, which they make over and over again, in my view, these kind of choices cannot be explained either by some fully rationalized, utility maximizing kind of individuals that economists like, or the sort of mindless mechanical selection that Richard Dawkins imagined. Now, in this kind of story, and now we're taking it a little bit towards new thinking, there are people whom I would like to call cultural entrepreneurs, okay? Now, what is important to understand in this framework is that everybody has the option to choose a particular set of preferences and beliefs, but you take everybody else's beliefs and preferences as given. Now, there's exceptions to that, okay? And that is the people who make it their mission to change the culture of many others, okay? Or maybe they don't set out to do that, but that's how it works, okay? And we could call these cultural entrepreneurs, and Governor Rice has a paper, Moral Entrepreneurs, which is very, very similar to this, okay? So how do these people deviate from the default option? And you can think of them, and I hope this I don't have to explain this, but it's like a focal point, basically, okay? So it allows a lot of dispersed beliefs to think, well, let's all focus on this particular thing, because I believe that everybody else believes such and such, and that will lead you to some kind of a sustainable outcome, okay? So what you have to have is that a cultural entrepreneur communicates something that is novel enough for people to change their minds, yet it has to resonate with many, and it is known to resonate with many, so it cannot be too novel and too radical, okay? So examples of cultural entrepreneurs we're all familiar with people like Confucius, Mohammed, Adam Smith, Darwin, Karl Marx, who basically, through a combination of these sort of cultural evolution biases, changed the beliefs and values of a large number of people for many generations. Now, of course, in some cases, that these changing cultural beliefs then feed back into institutional change, and those may lead to further cultural changes, okay? But the point, however, is that in order for society to be in some kind of reasonable equilibrium, we have to have a conformation between what the institutions are and what people call their cultural scaffolding, on which they rest. If they do not have that, then we would say that there's legitimacy involved and these institutions may not survive. Now, what about these cultural entrepreneurs, and why do they succeed? Well, there's a whole bunch of things that you can list, and I don't know if anybody here would think about it, probably come with a very similar list. Okay? What you need is, for one thing, a technological environment that supports and encourages oblique and horizontal transmission of cultural elements. Okay, so you have to be exposed to a lot of cultural elements that are not from your parents. Okay? So the printing press obviously would be a major factor in that. So would the internet and everything in between that we can all think of. Okay, now you can't be deviating, as I already said, too far from accepted beliefs. What you need to have is the absence or failure of suppression by powerful incumbents who would like to nip these novel ideas in the bud. What we need, perhaps more than anything else, is successful epigones and disciples and apostles who spread the new culture effectively. And finally, and this is my bow to historical materialism in an economic environment that is consonant with new ideas. So how does all this matter to the economic history and what I call the great dilemma? So the consensus is that culture affects economic performance through three main mechanisms, right? Trust and cooperation, which reduces transactions cost and makes market possible. Personal behavior and preference, such as people willing to work hard, sort of Max Weber kind of story of people willing to save. And finally, and here I'm coming closer to what I want to talk about, the attitudes toward nature and the environment, that is to say science and technology, and that is of course the purpose, okay? So what I'd like to submit is that the cultural entrepreneur who helped prepare the Industrial Revolution was Isaac Newton. More than perhaps anybody else. I have one competitor, but that's a different paper. Now, it's quite fair to say that he's an enlightened candidate for that position. Keynes, actually, the economist Keynes, has a very nice little essay about, posthumously published, about Newton the man, because he blocked a large amount of Newton's papers. And Margaret Jacob's contribution, among many, has been to recognize, also she never used the term, that Newton's role has been more than a scientist, he's been a cultural entrepreneur. Now, the direct connection between Newton's writings and the Industrial Revolution isn't so easy as it seems. Charles Gillespie, obviously represented earlier thinking, wrote that that's a 1960 book. It's very difficult to actually find in industrial operations any kind of theoretical concept from abstract formulation. And I think what Jacob has stressed is that Newtonians, at least for economic history, Newtonianism is more important than Newton for economic history. It consists of strong support for the belief of a rational, intelligible, mechanical, and therefore by implication, exploitable, or that's the key word, universe. And it's from the point of view of economic history, I think the importance of Newton for Enlightenment culture, of course, I have a different view of the Enlightenment as most of you will have, because for me, what really counts in the Enlightenment is what I've called the Industrial Enlightenment. There's another Enlightenment for you. There are so many of them already now, so I have an Industrial and Agricultural Enlightenment. Don't ask me. But its main message, okay, was that the emphasis on mathematical instrumentality, not only on explaining the deep causes of things, but it is the view of the world to establish natural regularities and show how they could be exploited without necessarily struggling with the difficult issue of what we call in economics micro-foundation, to say what's actually going on beneath the surface, as Descartes had done. It also, I think this is very important, it marks the high watermark, perhaps, of natural philosophy, the transnational European project. Many of the most enthusiastic followers of Newton, as maybe I've shown so many times, being on the continent. There's a whole list of people that you all know. And finally, and this year I'm going back to much early literature, I think Newton's work marks the culmination of the triumph of the so-called moderns over the ancients. And his work marks the beginning of, I think, a slow, but in some sense inexorable divorce of science from religion, which is, of course, very ironic, as many people have. And so in her book that she co-authored with my former and much lamented colleague, Betty Jo Dobbs, in 1995, a little but very neat little textbook. There's a wonderful line in there that I would like. And it's the popularization of Newton into Newtonianism that made him a cultural entrepreneur. And so here's a quote: by the middle of the 18th century, European children of some affluence were being taught to think mechanically, while their parents, first men and then gradually women, were attending courses in Newtonianism. This is really what a cultural entrepreneur does, okay? The Newtonians of Desaguliers' generation and beyond offered nothing less than utility, pleasure, and happiness to their age. Applied science promoted self-improvement, profit, and status. Now, in that regard, I think Newton became the model that illustrated Bacon's wildest hopes. In many areas, his name became almost synonymous with human ability to understand nature and other phenomena. And to become the Newton of anything was the ultimate acolyte in the 18th century, right? So we have Hume with the Newton of moral sciences, Wolff the Newton of metaphysics, Hartley the Newton of this, Cesare Beccaria was the Newtoncino, I think. Okay? Now, a lot of known physicists tried to cast their own work, even though it was fairly remote from, in terms of Newtonian methodology. Okay, so Geoffroy's first chemical affinity table claimed to be inspired by Newton. Boerhaave ascribed to Newton principles to explain the human body in terms of gravitation and attraction, God help us. And even David Hume, who really was skeptical to everybody, including Newton, but he's been argued to be modeled in part on Newton's successes in natural philosophy. And Hume certainly appears to want in places you read it to feel that he's modeling his project on successes of natural philosophy exemplified by Newton. And so, I think in the Age of Enlightenment, he becomes, at least for people living in the 18th century, the epitome of the potential of human rationality. And Peter Gay has a nice line in which he talks about in the deification of Newton, the Enlightenment and the philosophe and the Age of Enlightenment were one. And what I would like to submit to you is the fact that the most successful cultural entrepreneurs tend to exactly be subject to deification is the fate of many of the most successful cultural entrepreneurs, and we all know it. So do they really matter? Do cultural entrepreneurs really matter? And so, as an economic story, of course, we face this issue all the time. Do entrepreneurs really matter? You know? Would we have this and that if it hadn't been for Steve Jobs or Henry Ford or, tack. And of course, you can't be ever sure because we can't imagine what a world without Newton and Newtonianism would have looked like, okay? But I would say three statements are reasonably defensible, okay? The first, in the absence of any given cultural entrepreneur, including Isaac Newton, the broad outlines of the cultural change may have happened anyway, but the details may be quite different, and those details matter a lot. Secondly, entrepreneurs thrive in certain environments and not in others. And clearly we need to establish which conditions these environments were conducive for the success. And finally, they should be studied even if you could argue they were dispensable and that somebody else would have done it just as well, simply because I think they produce a unique window to study cultural changes and to see how they lead to institutional change. So here's one final cultural entrepreneur who's had a major influence, at least on one economist dabbling in history. Thank you, Ben.
Well, finis origine pendit, the end hangs on the beginning, I think does have something to do with Peg. You know, she wanted to be a nun. Now, and you know, what does it mean to want to be a nun? It means that communities matter an enormous amount to you. And one of the fundamental rhythms of her career from beginning to end has been this passion for rebuilding communities, seeing into lost communities, seeing how they work, seeing how they're structured. It's also someone who's very idealistic. And she's somebody who has looked for ideals and ideals that carry people in the past. And I think that's really been a rhythm from, you know, and then they are in ideals that are conditioned by social positions and ideals sometimes conditioned by politics, but there's always a powerful idea pushing and carrying. And you know, that's something that's been in her work from the very start. And I think probably goes back to the editor of Luther back at St. Joe's. 4 wonderful presentations, giving us 4 different takes. Joyce's biographical, diachronic, and really extraordinary sketch of the triple Peg, who is simultaneously hedgehog, fox, and gopher. David's Jacobean Enlightenment, kind of equally rich diachronic presentation of Peg's Enlightenment, which makes a formidable case for its coherence and power as an explanatory model. Darrin's wonderful evocation, it seems to me, of the trading zone as a key to Peg's work. The impure place, whether it's secret or open, where different peoples, different ideas come together, and it's out of collision that something new comes. And finally, Joel's fantastic Peg as cultural entrepreneur, the heir of Confucius, Jesus, and many more, which was the most surprising of them all, but makes a tremendous amount of sense in context. It's hard to add anything to these 4 wonderful perspectives, but I will try just to say a little bit. I think of Peg in terms of 2 of those great inventions of the scientific revolution, the microscope and the telescope. And it seems to me that one way to think about her achievement is that she's a master at using both of them, and that's very rare. There's a meme in the world outside scholarship that historians have drawn back from trying to do anything very general, very important, very significant, that we write more and more about less and less, that we devote ourselves to monographic mania at the expense of big historical conditions. And there's a rooted belief in the academy, which older scholars feel to their cost, that just as poets begin in gladness and end in madness, scholars begin in archives and monographs and end when they've lost it doing syntheses, when they're just a little bit past it and can't do the real work anymore. And it seems to me what this really is a statement that there are multiple methods. There is the telescope. You look back, you see a whole vast field, you lay it out, you do cartography, you do what in some fields are called meta-studies because you're a master of many secondary literatures. And there's the microscope, the tool that brings you up close, the tool that brings you into the coalface in archive after archive, that lets you come down into the tiny little dinner party in Avignon where where Jews and non-Jews are eating meat on Good Friday. Ouch! What's extraordinary about Peg is that throughout her career, she has been a master of both. She has never given up her observatory with its telescope, with its sense that she's looking at a whole Enlightenment, which is a European, indeed more than European phenomenon that has to be understood in all its levels, in all its national and local settings, in all its relationships to religion, to its social organization, to the media that carry it out, and above all to the rituals that move people together. And there has always been the master of the microscope, the archive rat, the person who knows where the documents are buried and knows how to find them and then knows how to interpret them. So one way to think about this extraordinary career is as a career which simply shows the fallacy of both of those memes, which shows that one way to be a great historian is to have this double perspective and keep it with you always, as she has. The one other thing I want to say, because it's the one big thing about her that hasn't quite, I think, been mentioned yet, is what an amazing reader Peg is. This is someone who reads texts of the most varied kinds. You just never know what you're going to hit in one of her books, whether it's going to be an archival document, whether it's going to be some bizarre Dutch play, supposedly comic, whether it's going to be Newtonian science, whether it's going to be a ritual. And she's a wonderful reader of ritual as well as a wonderful reader of texts. Those are somewhat separate skills, despite the Geertzian language that makes us bring them together. She's someone who knows how to take a text, a document, a literary, a scientific, a philosophical text, and see it, and see the multiple discourses running in it, the tensions between them, the many languages. And one of the things I've learned from her is that refusal to see only one language or one discourse in a text. Her insistence, which may seem strange to some people who know her as a powerful polemicist with a very firm interpretative line, that when it gets down to the microscope, things are always complicated. There's always going to be more you can see in that new document or that new text. And that must be one of the things that makes her such a great teacher. It is a pleasure, as someone who has been learning from Peg for a very long time and who remembers that first contact as a model of how a scholar further ahead in the profession should behave towards a younger scholar, and has seen her do this again and again, to be part of this tribute.
Good Lord. When I was a young scholar in my 20s, I lived in England, and I got an invitation to speak at Oxford, and I was so excited. I called my mother back in New York, and she hadn't a clue how the academy worked. And I said, "Ma, I've been invited to Oxford." And there was this long hesitation, and then in her lovely Irish brogue, she said, "And sure, how did they get your name?" I think I understand now how some people might have gotten my name. But with all of these absolutely wonderful, wonderful things that have been said, because they've been so wonderful, I think I have to say negative things. I mean, I have to find the Achilles heel that's underneath all of this ability to sit in archives, etc. I mean, Joyce says that I'm a fox or a hedgehog or a gopher, but actually I think I'm a slug. Because slugs can go to archives and just sit there for hours on end, never move. Nobody bothers you. The only thing you have to worry about is whether the heat's been turned on. Now, there's a downside to being an archive rat, and the downside for me came one January afternoon in Newcastle upon Tyne, in the North England Institute of Mining and Mechanical Engineering. when the snow came in through a hole in the roof of the archive, and I decided that it was time to quit Newcastle and go south. So even slugs have to move on sometimes. Hearing about all these different contexts that I've put in my work also suggests that I'm a really rather confused person. It's not clear, for example, am I an idealist? Do I believe that ideas are the forces that shape history? Or am I a materialist, some kind of renegade Marxist who fell off the ship around 1989 and have been trying ever since to put together some kind of coherent worldview? I fear someone like Christopher Hill might think that of some of my work. This search for space, for spaces in the past, may have a lot to do with feeling always not quite of any given space, of not quite belonging to all the places where you're supposed to belong, to the academy, certainly to no church, certainly to no particular community, and yet always looking in some way for those communities. I have been so incredibly touched by what you have said. I'm up here fighting for control so as to not appear to be sentimental or just break down and cry. So thank you very much. I'm deeply honored.